Squirrels! Sometimes the balanced team gets it wrong. Sometimes the balanced team gets it very wrong. Today's video is going to explore those times the balanced team got it very, very wrong, as we will be exploring the top 5 strongest decks in Legends of Runeterra's relatively short history. Let's begin. Number 5. The first deck on my list is actually the deck that appeared most recently during the game's lifespan, and that is Sin Targon. Sin is a champion that came out during the first expansion, Rising Tides, in late April 2020. Initially, Sin cost 6 mana, and whilst his abilities felt unique and powerful when they came off, ultimately he lacked both a supporting cast and felt just a little too slow. This changed with the release of Targon in the Call of the Mountain expansion, where Sin got some much needed support in the form of spells like Bastion and Zenith Blade. Most importantly though, Sin received a major buff himself in patch 1.10. In 1.10, Sin's cost was reduced by 2, as well as a stat decrease by 2 in his health, but overall this allowed Sin to influence the game much quicker and become a threat dangerously early in the game. Outside of Sin, what allowed this deck to flourish was the many ways Targon allowed Lee's attack to be buffed, through gems or support from cards like Mentor of the Stones. It was also able to give him Overwhelm through Zenith Blade, giving him both more stats and the opportunity to do double his attack damage when leveled up by kicking the opponent into the Nexus and then hitting it himself. Defensively, the deck was able to repel many different threats through Eye of the Dragon, who could summon her dragons to block out opponents or gain health attacking. Another option the deck used at the time was to simply hush the entire opponent's board, greatly reducing the potential of many different threats. The deck dominated any mid-range or late-game matchup due to the near impossible task of removing Sin once he was down, and due to the aforementioned Eye of the Dragon, it was able to repel aggro long enough to allow Lee to take over the game and potentially get a one-turn kill. Since those days, Sin, Hush and Bastion have all been nerfed, and the deck remains solid but not nearly as glorious as it once was. Number 4. For deck number 4, we return to just after the Rising Tides expansion and the game's full release. It's a deck many will be familiar with and many will look back upon with disdain. It is of course Burn Aggro. Whether it was played championless or maybe with a couple Teemos, this deck's efficiency for destroying an opponent's face hadn't been seen before and has not been seen since. Using a slew of cards that were only concerned with dealing face damage to the opponent, this deck quickly became meta-defining and ran rampant on ladder queues due to its fast-paced games and high win rate. Due to the few champions used, the deck was also very cheap, and so it didn't matter whether you were in High Masters or lowly Iron. This deck could turn up anywhere and tear your face off before you ever got to start your Von Yip Poro game plan. Notable cards within the deck included Boom Crew Rookie, the famous duo of Crimson Disciple and Imperial Demolitionist, the hope-destroying Noxian Fervor, and to finish them off, a nice little Decimate. This deck was so strong it completely warped the meta around it, with only itself and Shadow Isle's control decks with an abundance of healing being viable alternatives. Eventually, some notable culprits got nerfed, including Legion Rearguard, Legion Grenadier, Boom Crew Rookie, and Crimson Disciple, greatly reducing the deck's overall damage output. Number 3. For deck number 3, we need to go back in time before the game fully released, and we arrive at a good old Ezreal deck. There are many different Ezreal decks to choose from when talking about strong Runeterra decks of old. However, none were quite as soul-crushing nor as memorable as the one where he was paired with the unforgettably strong Elnuk Horde. Yes, we're talking about Ezreal Elnuks, and I understand some of the newer players in the audience may not quite understand just how crazy this little troop of Elnuks card used to be. So let me explain. See, Ezreal decks in those days really only had a couple weaknesses. One was being overwhelmed fairly early by strong aggressive decks, and sometimes there was the problem of dealing the full 20 damage with Ezreal without giving your opponent a chance to respond. The solution? Just drop 15-18 worth of stats on turn 5 across 4 bodies. This was not uncommon in the least, and it wasn't even the best outcome. It was possible to get 21-24 worth of stats across 6 bodies for 5 mana, and it actually happened a fair amount. Sure, it was possible to low roll and only get one other Elnock or none at all, but Ezreal in the deck was still strong enough to come back and win regularly. The mirror match was particularly lackluster, often coming down to a coin flip. Whoever had more Elnocks in the top 10 of their deck on turn 5 would often win the game outright. Soon enough, the Elnocks got nerfed, the hyper-geometric calculator was brought out, and the number got changed from Elnocks in the top 10 of the deck to the top 6, ending a reign of dominance for the Elnocks, who have not been heard from since in top meta circles. Number 2. This deck needs no introduction and is probably the deck most people expected to be on the list. It's one that survived different nerfs but eventually succumbed to the many nerfs it saw during its lifespan, as well as cards being introduced that tech very well against it. It is of course Kinku, or really just any Ionia elusives. Elusive decks have always been around and maybe always will be. Elusive units stop your opponent from being able to block your units with non-elusives. And in a game that is so combat focused, this of course is a major advantage. I referred to this deck as Kinku elusives, which perhaps is the term that has become most familiar with this kind of deck. However, to find the truly strongest elusive deck, we need to go back long before Kinku Wayfinder was ever close to getting in the deck, and back to the very early days of the open beta. To explain the absurdity of this deck, I think it's best to showcase a common play pattern. We begin with Inspiring Mentor, a card that has changed slightly many times during its lifespan, but initially it began as a 1-1 that granted a card in hand a 1-1 buff. Often this was the ideal turn 1 play, quickly followed up on turn 2 by a buffed Navori Conspirator, who at this point was a baseline 3-2. So, with a buff from Mentor, it was common to see a 4-3 elusive staring at you on turn 2. From there you could play Mentor again on 3, perhaps into a Green-Glade duo, or if you're lucky, another Conspirator. Then on turn 4 you had the option of playing a 2-3 Kinku Lifeblade, or maybe you want some card draw with your 2-2 Shadow Assassin. But wait! Your opponent finally tries to interact with you. They've got a spell in hand which can remove one of your precious elusive units. But no matter, you have 3 spell mana, and we all know what 3 spell mana means. You've got Deny. Happily deny anything they could possibly do with perhaps the most frustrating card in the entire game. Many will know this was often followed by a Brawl Mote at the same time. But what if your opponent starts to develop a threat of their own? What do you do then? Why, simply pay the 4 mana for Will of Ionia, of course. A lot of the cards from this deck had to be nerfed, and for good reason, but yet the deck evolved and still managed to hang around for some time, showing it to be one of the most resilient and powerful decks the game has ever seen. Before we get to the number 1 spot, here are some honourable mentions. Trundle Ramp. When combined with Shadow Isles, the deck used Ramp and Trundle's big body to get to the late game and then stomp opponents with either War Mother's Call or Feel the Rush. Bannerman. A mono Demacia powerhouse whose ghost is still seen lurking in Scouts decks to this day. At its peak, this mid-range list dominated with board states none could match, and then used Cytherea the Bold to close out games with a bang. Heimervai. Who could forget this gem, which when combined with Targon and the ability to both silence an opponent's board with Hush and create 5 elusive turrets in the same turn, the deck clearly dominated for good reason. Eventually Heimer himself would see the nerf hammer and the deck would fade somewhat. Karma Ezreal. This deck essentially asked people whether they could win before turn 10. If not, well, you lost. Simple as that. Both champions would eventually see themselves get nerfed. Karina Control! Just after the Rising Tides expansion, it was quickly discovered Vi was insane, and no deck better showcased this than Karina Control, which used Ledros and Karina Varaza to slowly destroy opponents' souls. Ash Frostbite, a personal favourite of mine which used big mid-range bodies to dominate boards and Frostbites to dominate combat. And now, number 1. Finally, the number 1 overpowered deck during Runeterra's lifespan so far is Fearsome Midrange. Anyone who played the game in the early days of the open beta will remember this absolute powerhouse of a deck. This deck was far, far above every other deck that was played in the early days of the game and saw the nerf hammer come in a lot of different ways. Essentially, the core of the deck was a mono Shadow Isles list that either flexed in Ionia for Deny and Shadow Assassin or P and Z for Mystic Shot and Progress Day. A lot of the cards in this deck got nerfed. In fact, if we look at a general Ionia list taken from the time, 9 of the 16 different cards used in the deck got nerfed at some point. They include Hecarim, Frenzied Skitterer, Shadow Assassin, Wraithcaller, Rasa, Ledros, Mark of the Isles, Black Spear, and Deny. When more than half of your cards get nerfed, and within a fairly short time frame for most of them, it shows how unbelievably ridiculous this deck was. Let me explain why this deck was so strong. In the early game, it would often use creatures like Elise, Frenzied Skitterer, or Wraithcaller to generate a solid board full of fearsome attackers. Remember, this is before any expansion, so there were less options for finding solid blockers in the early turns. But the real power of the deck came later on, often dropping Hecarim on turn 6, who at the time had 6 health, and his additional attackers had 3 attack each, meaning each attack he generated 10/10 worth of stats across 3 bodies. If attacking on turn 7, an open attack by Hecarim was then followed by Rasa, who would quickly dispatch of whatever prized units the opponent had tried to save. And if by some miracle the opponent lived to fight on, they would then be met by Ledros, who would quickly dwindle their health and leave them with no options. This deck defeated Aggro by outclassing it early and building very strong board states extremely quickly. It defeated midrange by simply outvaluing them every single turn. It defeated control by applying constant pressure and then using Deny to stop any attempt at salvation. This was by far the best deck at the time, and to this day I believe the best deck Legends of Runeterra has ever seen. So thanks for watching this somewhat different video about Legends of Runeterra this time. Be sure to leave a like, comment your thoughts about the list, and sub for more Legends of Runeterra content, and let me know if you enjoyed this kind of video and would like to see more.